supervise everybody in terms of the questions. So please use the chat and I'll post some information in the chat about Mike's book, JoAnn's new book, and other interesting things. Thank you. Still more people coming. Okay.
Good. Right. Great.
Okay. JoAnn Wypijewski is a writer based in New York City. She wrote the introduction to Mike's book. She has a new book out herself, which we will let you know about in the chat. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to her.
Hi, everybody. So it's great to be here. It's an honor to introduce Mike Stout. It was an honor to introduce his book. I first met Mike, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in the kitchen of Stoughton and Alice Lynn's house in Niles, Ohio, sometime in the early 2000s during a steel crisis. What else? And Stoughton has written, Stoughton, as many of you know, is a great long-time fighter for the human person against the power system, civil rights activist, labor lawyer, labor activist, really human rights advocate and fighter. But later I met Mike for lunch on at some sort of brew pub or something on the burial grounds of the Homestead Works. And the book, Homestead Steel, the Final 10 Years, USWA Local 1397, and the Fight for Union Democracy is what we're here to talk about and to celebrate today. And the book is about those last years of the works. It's about the battles, it's about the thrills of trying to create a democratic union. It's about the problems, it's about the strengths and weaknesses of people. It's about organizing, it's about victory and defeat. It's about the workers and work processes. It's about the work itself, the work of industrial production and the work of building union democracy. And for those unfamiliar with steel processes, it's perhaps enough to know at this point, although if you read this book, you will get a very clear sense of what it takes, what it took to work in that steel mill, what it took to build the built world. And so just to give you a sense of the labor behind the built world, this is from my introduction. Homestead workers made beams for the Empire State Building. Their collective hand is embedded in the structures that millions encounter unthinking every day. Cross the Verrazano Narrows or the Golden Gate, that hand is there. Pose for a photograph at Rockefeller Center or the St. Louis Arch, it is there. Enter the United Nations buildings, curse the traffic on the Oakland Bay Bridge, depend on the Hoover Dam, it is there. Visit Carnegie Hall or the Frick Museum in New York, and the amassed wealth they represent is the surplus labor of homestead workers, whose union Andrew Carnegie and his plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, decided to break by armed force in 1892, aided by the state, aided quite successfully by the state. Of the homestead workers themselves, which had sprawled for 4 miles, almost nothing remains. A few brick smokestacks tower above a grassy slope near a shopping center and some parking lots. So that's where I met Mike, on that grassy slope. And Mike describes what it was like before deindustrialization, before that defeat of the workers. in 1987. In the heyday, when he first arrived as a young worker, a fellow who had a history in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement, among the yippies. I mean, Mike was kind of a Zelig figure. He'd always been involved with unions, he'd always had jobs, but he'd also always been a political actor. Uh, and and we're going to talk, I mean, I suspect he's going to talk quite a lot about uh, the union and the struggle and what it meant and what it means, because it has resonance. This is not just dead history. But it's also a very beautiful book, and it's a very descriptive book. And the names of the people, the names of the workers, the work they did, as I said, is very well and visually present. But I just wanted to read, if I might, the opening of chapter 1, which is the before of that grassy slope, that burial ground. And that chapter is called Strange Beauty, and it begins, after growing up in a suburban Southern university town like Lexington, Kentucky, and spending 7+ years in the skyscraper jungles of New York City, I found Homestead, Pennsylvania in 1977 to be a whole different universe. Smoke billowed everywhere. A cloud of dust hung over the town like a multicolored dome, changing hues depending on the type of steel rolled. Church steeples jutting above the smoke everywhere, 20 in Little Homestead alone. They were only outnumbered by bars, sometimes 4 on every corner of an intersection. The town was alive and lit up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Its hustle and bustle rivaled my experience in Las Vegas and Myrtle Beach, only in an industrial setting. There were ethnic social clubs everywhere: Polish, Russian, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Irish, Italian, you name it. It was like some kind of ancient giant strip mall combined with roadside stands like those that clutter the avenues in Midtown Manhattan in New York City. The main avenues near the mill were lined with fruit stands, butcher shops, delis, clothing and furniture stores, five and dimes, car dealers, whorehouses, and just about anything you wanted or needed on your way into work. All of this in the colossal shadows of a giant steel mill that spanned 4 boroughs. So I think that should give you a sense of the world Mike entered. Um, and Mike himself became quite quickly, partly by temperament, partly by the moment, the political moment, partly by chance. He became involved in one of the last industrial union battles and the last battles for workplace democracy in the industrial realm in this country. And from 1978 to 1987, he writes, I was at the epicenter, of the rank and file movement at the Homestead Steel Mill as a local union griever and later grievance chair. The basic steel contracts between US Steel and the United Steelworkers used the language of grievance man and grievance chairman back in those days, so he will be using those words. He wrote for and edited the union newspaper. He was a co-initiator of many coalitions in which the local union was involved. And he says, the important story of that moment is history that needs to be told from the inside. As I write, I believe it's the radical history of a people who are too often told they have none. And so I am so thrilled for Mike that this book is real. And I'm so happy to introduce and celebrate him. Thank you, Mike Stout.
Thank you, JoAnn. The one thing she left out of her story when she came to interview me in Homestead was she was in, I can't remember the make of the car, but it was from the 1960s and it was a convertible.
The
And
19,
we were driving down 8th Avenue, and I believe this was circa 2004, 2005, and it epitomized my entire experience at Homestead, that I really always felt I was in two worlds at one time. I was in this make-believe world outside me that I had come from, that it had all these different parts to it. But then I was in this industrial world that seemed to sit in time forever. And when I look at the mall, when I look at what's there, I don't see them all.
We're not hearing you, Mike. Maybe you froze. Mike, we're not hearing you.
They're talking about, they're not gonna, they don't have a prayer. And luckily we had a district director at the time who saw the meetings, the union meetings suddenly increased from 30 and 40 to 250 to 300. And he said, we better fight this case. And he got a high up union lawyer and an outside lawyer, and they came in and we won the case. Not one penny was taken back, but what this one incident did is it took the rank and file caucus and actually, if not legally at the time, in reality, replaced the local union officials that were in office. And they, with this victory, workers from all over the mill all of a sudden flanked to the rank and file caucus. And it grew literally from 15 to 20 to hundreds. And it was self-financed, it was democratic, decisions were made jointly at big meetings, it usually in the back rooms of bars. They raised their own money for the newspaper and other events with a raffle ticket. That's something you don't see today. It's a raffle ticket that actually had 10 numbers on it, and it cost $1. And if you won 50 bucks. And by the second year or third year the rank and file caucus started, they were raising enough money to print 6,000 newsletters and distribute them throughout the mill. At the same time, rank and file people throughout the mill started not only taking up grievances that their grievance people wouldn't take up for them, but starting to fight for bigger issues that involve not only them, but the entire steelworkers union and the steel mills throughout the country. And one of those issues was the right to ratify our own contracts. We did not, steelworkers back then, have the right to ratify our own contracts. It was ratified by the union presidents. And the union presidents would have these get-togethers every 3 years, and they would decide whether or not to ratify a contract. And in more cases than not, and I can certainly speak for Homestead, we had no say in our own contract, and we had no say in anything. And at the same time this was happening in the 1970s, in particular, I would say the 75 to 1978 period, the steel mills were going through their last hurrah. And by that, I mean there was a hiring binge. And Homestead alone from 70, I believe it was from 74 to 78, there was over 1,000 new workers hired. The 1,000 workers were consisted of three different people. One were young, culturally radical, culturally different people than our parents, like myself, and a whole slew of Vietnam veterans that had come back from the war, and they weren't very happy with their experience over in Vietnam, and they certainly weren't happy with what they came back to in the United States. Secondly, you had African Americans for the first time in sizable numbers, and thirdly, you had women in sizable numbers. And I would say probably close to 50% of the 1,000 or so that were hired into Homestead were women. And there was a consent decree that was filed by Alabama steelworkers in 1973 that was enjoined by Homestead steelworkers in 1974, attacking the blatant discrimination against African Americans, promotional rights, seniority rights, what have you, that existed throughout the steel industry, and also the lack of any hiring for women. So what the consent decree literally ordered was that half of the people that had hired had to be either minorities or women. So for the first time, women and minorities came in the mill. So all of a sudden you had a combination of real shit working conditions, lack of any safety and health, a management that was so top down, they literally resembled feudal lords, overlords. And then at the same time all that was going on, you had this mass influx of these young people that came into the mill. And I might add, at the same time at Homestead, you had an old guard that had existed for some years in a minority. Some, especially the black members, were ex-members of the Communist Party, USA, but no longer active in it, but still worked at the mill. And then you had a sizable number of people like Ron Wiesen, who were just militant, who were just eye for an eye, don't give me no shit, I'm going to give it right back to you if you do type of people. And I think it was that combination at that period of time that brought about the rank and file caucus, and that brought about the rank and file upsurge. So in 1978, a short time after I had been there, there was an election for the International Convention that year, and the rank and file ran a slate of 11 and won all 11 positions, and the writing was on the wall. The union meetings, by the way, back in those days resembled barroom brawls. There had to be cops stationed at the door. As soon as somebody like Ronnie would get up to speak and start talking, or somebody like Michelle, the president would pound his gavel down and say, "Meeting adjourned," and fistfights broke out, arguments were everywhere. There was a real brouhaha going on at the time. So when all these young people came in, it was a whole different ball game. And so what happened was we won the 11 delegates in 1978, and then in May 1979 was the local union elections. And the rank and file took all 12 of the officers, the top local union officers, and also took, I believe it was 5 out of the 8 grievance positions in the mill, and immediately announced that Ronnie, at the very first union meeting, which I still have pictures of in May 1979, there was some 250 to 300 people at the union meeting. There was a standing ovation for about a half an hour, and Ronnie got up and talked. John Presley, who headed up our Civil Rights Committee. If anybody here knows who Fred Hampton was back in 1968 and 69, you're talking to Fred Hampton in the name of John Presley, working inside a steel mill. He was militant, he was articulate, he had a vision, and he knew what the problem was in terms of discrimination. He gave a speech at the local union meeting that took me back literally 10 years to the Fred Hampton days in 1968 and 1969. Ronnie gave a talk, and he says this whole thing's going to turn upside down, and he announced the reactivation of 5 or 6 committees that had been dormant, that nobody had been involved in, and also announced that there was not only a civil rights committee, but that there was a women's committee. And everybody was looking around the room, especially a women's committee in a steel mill. It was like very, very radical idea right from the beginning. But also what happened was when the movement started, there was literally 3 different factions broke down. There was a left-wing faction, I'll call it, or a radical faction that I was part of, Michelle was part of, Ronnie was part of. John Ingersoll was part of, but also there was a middle faction in the sense of people that were just union people who wanted to be good grievance people and be good union people, and they weren't real politically involved in anything else. But then there was a real right-wing faction, and the right-wing faction were the ones that came in on the coattails of the 4 or 5 people that started the movement. And the right-wing faction immediately decided that they were going to root out all the left-wing Reds and communists and socialists or whatever out of the union. So a big battle broke out inside the local union at the time, literally within a month after we took office. And they tried to root out a bunch of us, and they were totally unsuccessful. Ronnie, basically, who was in the middle of the brouhaha, decided that that's not the way we're going to operate, and we're going to continue to be a militant rank and file union, and we're going to continue to do everything we can to involve the membership in the union. So the right wing basically was, most of them were pushed out of the local union within the next 3 years and neutralized. At the same time, committees were activated. Not the Civil Rights Committee, the Women's Committee, the Workers' Safety and Health Committee, things you've never heard of like the Incentive Committee to revamp the incentive thing, and most importantly, the Grievance Committee that I was part of. I was appointed we had a 3-structured grievance, which is the same. If you go to the United Electrical Workers or other unions, they have a shop steward system. And the Steelworkers Union, it was the same thing, but it was called a grievance system. We had assistant grievance people who represented people at the departmental level. And then we had zone grievance people, and they were elected zone grievance people. And they were in charge of entire divisions in the mill, like the slab and plate division, which was the 100-inch plate mills, 45 slab mill, and the slab yard, and all the maintenance departments inside those was one division. The structural division was another division. They had their own grievance man. So there was zone grievance people. And then there was the chairman of the grievance committee, which was in charge of the entire grievance, all the grievance people themselves. The chairman was elected from one of the grievance people, but in a separate election. So the initial chairman of the grievance committee that got elected under the rank and file turned out to be, if he wasn't a plant, he acted like a plant for the company. He started doing exactly what the former chairman did, was drop all the grievances by the time they got to the 3rd step and not allow the grievances to be heard in court or arbitration. We found out about it, and luckily, the opposition and the international union were so afraid of us, they contested the election and made us have a new election, which was great because not only did all of us get reelected again, but now we got to replace the chairman of the grievance committee. And this other guy came in, John O'Toole, and John was, again, he didn't go to college. He was just a smart cookie. He was real smart. He was out of the Boilermaker department in central maintenance. He was an avid book reader. He was an avid labor historian, and he was put in charge, chairman of the grievance committee. And he just completely turned the entire grievance, the whole grievance procedure upside down. We put the word out to everybody that we were going to represent you, and we didn't care who you were, how old you were, what color you were, what nationality or sex you were, and we didn't care, what's more, what you thought of us. In fact, I made it a point at that time, starting as first as a assistant grievance man, and then in 1981, I got elected zone grievance man unanimously. In fact, nobody ran against me, and got elected chairman of the grievance committee again in 1985, and also zone grievance man, and never had anybody ran against me. And I think one of the reasons I didn't was my style of union officialdom was so completely radical and different. Like, I put the word out in writing and verbally. I would go up to people and I'd tell them, I said, I know you don't like me. I said, I know you're jealous. Like, who the hell is this young whatever from Kentucky with 4 years in the mill coming in here getting, I said, I know you're jealous. I know you don't like it. I know you don't trust me. And I said, and then I went up to someone, I said, I know you're calling me a communist. I know you're calling me this and that. I said, you know what, asshole? I said, I'm going to represent you harder than I represent the people that like me. I'm going to represent you, and I'm going to show you what a union's supposed to be all about. And when you come in with that attitude and then you put it into practice, and secondly thing I did, and John O'Toole did also, was the person filing the grievance. We had this archaic grievance procedure that was just something out of the 19th century. It was 5 steps. It was the same thing over and over at the first 4 steps, and then the 5th step being court and arbitration. The old days, the grievant never was anywhere beyond maybe if he was lucky the 1st and 2nd step. By the time it got to the 3rd step, he wasn't there. By the time it got to the 4th step, it was handled by an international union staff man, and they probably never even saw or met the griever. I mean, it was archaic. So the first thing we did is we revamped the grievance procedure. And I started handling cases, and John O'Toole, from 1st step all the way to arbitration. We sent a letter to the International Union and said, your staff men are no longer wanted here. We will handle our own cases in arbitration. I don't know why the International, I think they agreed to it because they thought we were a bunch of dumb bunny mill hunkies, uneducated steel mill workers who knew nothing about law or contract. So they, yeah, okay, go ahead. You can have. And plus they thought, well, this will save us a lot of money. He says, we're not going to have to pay for it, this, blah, blah, blah. Go ahead. So we started handling our own cases. And the main thing we started doing was we not only started involving the grievant in their own case and bringing them to every single meeting from 1st step all the way to arbitration, but we started involving the workers around them in the grievances too. And by the time I got to be elected zone grievance man in 1981, the shutdowns and the massive displacement and dissolution of the entire steel industry in the Mon Valley had started and had been underway since late 79, early 1980. And what happened was U.S. Steel learned a very, very valuable lesson from the Youngstown shutdowns, which happened between 1977 and late 78. In Youngstown, 3 mills, 4 steel mills, totaling 10,000 steel workers were all shut down at the same time, literally within a year and a half. And there was a massive upheaval in Youngstown. Workers took over buildings. There was demonstrations in the streets in the thousands for weeks on end. There was meetings in the hundreds where workers didn't just get together and complain and rag and call management names. They said, fuck this bullshit. Let's take this mill over ourselves. We don't need them. He says, we run the damn place. We know how it runs and we know what we need. So the workers called meetings and joined up with the Episcopal Diocese of Youngstown, established a coalition that included the community, the religious community, and also the workers and the unions. They put a coalition together called the Tri-State Conference on the Impact of Steel. This committee and this coalition put together a plan to save the steel mills and to put together a battle plan for how to get there and how to go about actually making that happen. And the plan included upgrading equipment there, combining different mills into one big steel mill, bringing in basic oxygen electric furnaces to replace the open hearths, and actually recruited former management people from Youngstown to be part of this effort. The townspeople themselves, ordinary workers and community people, raised close to $4 million to put a fund together to buy the mill. But in order for the town and the workers to buy the mill and upgrade it, they needed to get a loan, a low interest grant from the federal government to get a BOP shop, a basic oxygen furnace or electric furnaces, and a continuous caster put in. They approached the Carter administration. Carter promised them he would give them the $100 million grant. And then within about 3 weeks of the election in November 1980, Carter reneged on the promise and left the Youngstown workers hanging with this giant coalition together, with a management team together, with workers ready to go back to work. He reneged on the loan, and it completely crushed the Youngstown workers' efforts. And in January 1980, at a meeting with about 300 steelworkers, including some of us from Homestead, marched down in bitter cold weather and took over the steel building, the U.S. Steel headquarters in Youngstown, and held it for an entire day. And probably one of the biggest mistakes that we made during this entire struggle going 10 years was on that day, and on a previous day, November 30th, 1979, when we took over the first 2 floors of the U.S. Steel building in Pittsburgh, which is now the UPMC building for all you Pittsburghers out there. It was U.S. Steel building, and U.S. Steel, there wasn't no UPMC sign up there. It said U.S. Steel. And we had 600 steel workers, and we took over the first 2 floors. And when we went to get on the elevators to go up to Roderick's office, they turned the electricity off. And workers were frozen everywhere. We had 600 people on the first 2 floors, probably for about 4 hours. The biggest mistake we made was leaving that fucking building. We should have stayed there till they dragged us out with every policeman they had in the area. Same thing happened in Youngstown. Took over the entire U.S. Steel building in Youngstown and held it for an entire day. And what happened was the company sent a negotiating team in and promised the workers that they would sit down with them, and promised the workers, just like they used to promise Native Americans 400 times over back in the 19th and early 20th century, promised the workers they would sit down and consider and look at seriously their plan to take over the mill. So based on that promise, the union leadership said, let's leave the building and go into negotiations. And some of the workers didn't want to leave. One of them was Ed Mann. Ed is my all-time hero. He was a socialist. He was anti-war. He was a humanitarian, and he was the best union fighter. He led wildcat strikes, and he was dragged away, probably arrested a dozen times during his Youngstown days, even up to the time within a year of his death, he was getting dragged away to jail. But he didn't want to leave the building, but he was outnumbered. And so they left the building. And what did U.S. Steel do? They turned around and refused to talk to the workers and reneged on their promise. And it destroyed the movement. And at the same time that happened, by this time, steel workers were had run out of unemployment benefits, and there was no jobs in town. There was zero jobs in that area. And the majority of steel workers who didn't have a retirement eligibility had to leave the area. Well, when U.S. Steel saw that happen in Youngstown, they said, well, we're going to do things differently in the Mon Valley. We're going to shut the steel industry down here, but we're going to do it piecemeal. We're going to shut it down department by department, parts of mill by parts of mill. And when we shut it down, we're going to call it a temporary indefinite shutdown. And what that did is that killed 3 birds with 1 stone for the company. 2, they didn't have, by shutting it all down at the same time, there would have been a massive upheaval like nothing that was seen in Youngstown, just by the very vast numbers of steel workers and young steel workers and women and African Americans that we had inside all 7 of U.S. Steel mills. There would have been an upheaval like this country. It would have been as good or better than 1892. Company knew that. So they said, we'll shut it down piecemeal. We'll call it temporary indefinite. So what that did, when they called it temporary and indefinite, was the workers whose department was closed were given the impression that their department was going to reopen. Or if that didn't happen, they had an option with their seniority rights to bump to a different part of the mill or a different department. And thirdly, what it did for the company is by calling it temporary and indefinite, it allowed them to skirt their pension and their severance issues, which were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Homestead alone, it was tens of millions of dollars in severance and pension pay. You had 2 years when you got laid off to accumulate seniority. You had 5 years, even though you weren't accumulating seniority, that if something started back up, you had a right to go back in and go back to work based on the amount of time that you did have. So by calling it temporary indefinite, they said, we'll just wait this out for 2 years. Their rights to be called back to get any benefits will run out, and we'll wait it out for 5 years, and we won't have to give them severance pay because it was like their 5 years is up. That was their game plan. Their game plan was to not only shut it down and not only to invest in oil and real estate and other more lucrative adventures, but U.S. Steel actually started investing in and forming joint ventures with steel companies all over the world, from Italy to the Philippines and Indonesia to Colombia. And they not only started investing in those mills, but I know and personally am friends with former steel workers at Homestead who ended up going and helping to build and construct steel mills in the Czech Republic, in the Philippines, and in Colombia. So U.S. Steel not only was divesting out of the steel, but and these going into these other industries, but they were actually getting their steel themselves from steel mills overseas. All their jingoism, all their buy American, all their the threat is real from foreign steel was nothing but bullshit smokescreen that they got the union to buy into, the international union, and we never bought into it. Our line was the threat is real from U.S. Steel. So at that point, when the mill started shutting down, the company had signed a contract in 1980 that got some concessions, but not anywhere near enough. So they began to systematically violate the contract and started laying people off en masse, especially beginning in 1981. Tens of thousands of people were laid off. Homestead had one day alone in September 1981, 1,800 people were laid off, never to come back to work. At the same time people were laid off, they wanted to maintain the same amount of production. So crews that were formerly 10 to 15 people were now 2 people or now 3 people doing the work of them. They also started using overtime to keep from calling people back. So people, instead of using 2 employees, 16 hours, they would use, or 3 employees for 24, they would use 2 employees with 10 or 12-hour shifts, illegally, completely illegally. The other thing they started doing was systematically contracting out our work to non-union shops that were small in nature, number one, and number two, about half of these shops were set up by former U.S. Steel management people. So they basically started violating the contract. So most of my grievances at that time and fights were around job elimination in one form or another. It was crew combinations, forced overtime, or just simply eliminating positions that shouldn't have been eliminated, or forcing one person to do the job of 3 people. So I literally had to start filing, and John O'Toole and other grievance reps, thousands of grievances. At the same time that happened, I was part of 2 other efforts. We needed a mutual sustain. We needed somehow to help steelworkers survive that were getting laid off. So a bunch of us had a party. We passed a joint around. Everybody turned up the music. And all of a sudden, one of our members who, in fact, died recently, Artie Leibowitz, one of only 4 Jewish people that worked in the Homestead Steel Mill, he said, why don't we have a rock concert? He said, why don't we raise some money with a rock concert? And then I said, yeah, and why don't we have a food bank? And the food bank was based on the unemployment, the response that the Communist Party and others had, similar to when the layoffs happened back in the Great Depression back in the 1930s and 1940s. So I said, yeah, we'll start a food bank. So we got a rock concert together. We started a food bank. At the same time, a group of radicals and 4 other mills started a food bank. And within 1 year, we were feeding 1,200 people twice a month with at least 2 to 3 bags of groceries. And we were very particular about what type of groceries we gave them. We had an active unemployed committee. The unemployed committee was important not only to keep people's spirits up, but also to fight for benefits and to fight for what today you would call maintenance income. We had not only fights to extend unemployment benefits, which were only 6 months at the time. We extended unemployment benefits to up to 12 and 18 months, but we also had a program in steel called Trade Readjustment Allowance. Trade Readjustment Allowance had been negotiated in the 1973 contract, and it allegedly was to fight foreign imports. And what the bill said, which was passed by Congress, was that if a steel worker or a bunch of steel workers lost their jobs and that steel was being produced by some company overseas, then they could file for Trade Readjustment Allowance or TRA benefits. And if their claim was okayed, they would get an extra year of unemployment benefits, 12 months, plus they would get 2 years of schooling free. So the law had fallen by the wayside, in fact, expired. So our unemployed committees, not only from Homestead, but from other mills, which had formed a Mon Valley Unemployed Committee that consisted of all the other mills, started taking bus trips to Harrisburg, to Washington, D.C. We would take 4 or 5 buses of angry steelworkers, and we would just bust into Congress. We wouldn't ask for meetings. We wouldn't call ahead of time and say we want to meet with our representative. We would just bust in and go to their offices. And within a matter of, I would say, 3 or 4 months, through the late John Hines, who was a Republican senator at the time, by the way, he spearheaded an effort to reenact Trade Readjustment Allowance and the TRA bill. And the Congress at the time, and certainly the companies, didn't fight it because they didn't think it meant anything. They thought, well, who cares? Who cares if they have TRA? Well, what it did, it opened up Pandora's box. And after a 2-year struggle, literally probably well over hundreds of thousands of steel workers accessed TRA, which gave them an extra year of unemployment insurance, 2 years of schooling, and for many were a difference between life and death. So we had the food bank going, we had the unemployed committee going, I had the grievance committee going, and my grievance committee was not me as some big shot grievance man. My grievance committee was a committee of militants who were not afraid of the company, who were not afraid to stand up to them, and who are not afraid to represent their members and involve their members in whatever fight they were fighting in. So at the same time I had those 3 things going, we reactivated, Charlie McAllister and I started out. We recruited 3 priests, and a good friend who just recently died, Bob Erickson, a lawyer and good friend, Jay Hornack, and we reconstituted the Tri-State Conference on Steel in Pittsburgh, which had fallen apart when Youngstown struggle dissipated and fell apart. So we reactivated and we reformed the Tri-State Conference on Steel. So at the same time that we joined with the Mon Valley Unemployed Committee and were demonstrating in the streets week in and week out. There were some demonstrations back, I want people here to know, that were as many as 4,000 and 5,000 people were happening back in 1982 and 1983. 4,000 and 5,000 people when Ronald Reagan came to town to promote his jobs program, which was just a bunch of bullshit. On April 5th, 1983, it was pouring down rain and 4,000 laid off steel workers and unemployed workers showed up in front of the Hilton Hotel. And at one point, when it looked like Reagan was coming out the front door, we rushed to the front door and started giving the finger, which is on the front page of my book, and everybody broke out in a chant, "Screw Nancy, not the workers." And Reagan was so afraid his team inside had to create a back door, pull a limousine up right up to the door and sneak him out the back. It was such an angry militant demonstration. So at the same time we were demonstrating in the streets, at the same time I was fighting him in court, the Tri-State Conference on Steel put a plan together. And the plan was what are we going to do besides protest them? Let's have a plan that actually reopens the steel mill under new ownership, under new conditions, with new equipment, with new labor management relations, and involves and reacts with the community. So we found a law that was passed in 1945 by the companies, and it was a law that was passed to raise downtown Pittsburgh, clear out the riffraff, the housing, the poor, and build their gateway center downtown Pittsburgh, their corporate headquarters. Well, within the law, it gave the right of any borough or city to form an industrial authority. So we looked at the law, and at the suggestion of Frank O'Brien, who was one of the founders of the Tri-State. Frank was, everybody here should know, is another one of my heroes. He was president of the JNL local on the south, in the Hazelwood side of Pittsburgh. He was one of the dues rebels in 1956 that opposed the dues raising. He was with the militant opposition inside the steelworkers back in the 50s, and Frank was a state representative for Hazelwood area. And Frank came up with the idea, along with Stout and Lynn. He says, well, they set up an industrial authority and they used eminent domain to knock houses down, supposedly to expand the steel mill. He says, why don't we, the people, use eminent domain under this industrial authority law and take the steel mills ourselves and say, hey, you don't want them, here's your fair market value, get the hell out of here, we'll run the mills ourselves. So we went about for the next 4 years, Tri-State, at the same time all this other stuff was happening, of forming a Steel Valley Authority. And believe me, you have no idea, going into a community that in many ways was as provincial and set in his ways. Allegheny County is not like other areas of the country. Allegheny County, within our one county, we have 132 municipalities, and that includes the city of Pittsburgh and the city of McKeesport. Every municipality was a fiefdom. It had its own little government, its own police force, its own maintenance crew. They were very provincial, and they had been for years. Just to go in there and convince 10 of those communities to join together to form an industrial authority, literally, I would say I went to somewhere between 50 and 100 meetings personally, talking to borough officials, holding their hands, saying, you're not going to get sued, we'll protect you. I had Jay Hornack would be with me, a lawyer, young activist lawyer, who was in the Tri-State, and he'd have to show them in writing, you're not going to be held liable because you are part of this authority, etc. So we put the idea of forming the Steel Valley Authority out. In the heart of the shutdowns, they shut the Duquesne Works, which was right next door to Homestead, down completely, and announced in 1984, September, that they were tearing it down, including tearing down a blast furnace. And that was the spark that lit the prairie fire. For 4 years, Tri-State tried to get the public to understand that we had a plan to save a portion of our manufacturing base, a very important portion of it. We had a plan to do that, not just to protest its closing, but a plan to reopen it. The public was afraid to buy into the plan. It was too radical. It was too militant. When Dorothy 6 was shut down, which was a blast furnace at Duquesne, one of the most modern, productive blast furnaces in the country, so productive that it was given the Iron Masters Award in December 1983 for how productive they were. When that was announced, not only that it was shut down permanently, but was going to get torn down, it ignited a movement in support of the Tri-State Conference Plan. We called town meetings. We called one in Duquesne. 800 people jammed into a church, probably another 1,000 to 2,000. Couldn't get into the church, couldn't find a place to park. We hired, through the Steelworkers Union, a firm from New York City, who actually is one of the people on this line, Mike Locker, who's an old friend. I love you, Mike. Was brought in to do a feasibility study and came out with the findings of his study at this meeting, that in fact, through a public authority, we could operate the mill. We could be productive, and we could even make a profit. And the town bought into it, not only the idea of the authority, but within 2 months of that meeting, 10 towns, including the city of Pittsburgh, formed the Steel Valley Authority. What happened next was we began to put together a management team to find customers for the mill, to put an ownership package together. And our ownership package consisted of workers, the community, and the private sector. But the private sector were people who had a physical, material, monetary interest in the mill itself operating. For instance, Duquesne Light Company. For instance, the customers who bought the products from the mill. They were the private sector that we approached. So we were putting together a public-private worker buyout. It was a brand new concept. Nobody had really ever talked about, much less actually tried to do at that point. So people bought into it. We bought into it. We began to do studies, and then we made, and the International Union made a critical mistake. They invited in a law firm from Wall Street called Lazard Frères. And Lazard Frères were the people that put the, they got New York City out of bankruptcy in 1975, in the 1990s. And that New York declared bankruptcy in 1975. I'm not sure what year they got out, but Lazard Frères was the law firm that got them out. Also, there was an employee ownership buyout at Weirton Steel in West Virginia that the Lazard Frères had overseen. And it, by the way, is closed now. But they had overseen that, and it was a phony buyout, worker buyout. The workers had 2 or 3 seats on the board, but they called no shots. But Lazard Frères was bought in. People like Mike Locker were pushed out of the way. They brought in the big boys. The big boys decided, we're not going to let you open this place up because we'll never lend you the money because you can't make the rate of profit that needs to be made. And instead of what we should have done at the time is we should have got some chains and locks and locked ourselves to the plants and the mills and said, pull us out of here screaming. Instead, we bought into, okay, we can't open it. And then we moved on to the next battle. You got to remember, we had not only steel mills, but we had electrical plants closing. So by that time, UE, United Electrical Workers, represented the workers at Switch and Signal in Swissvale, Pennsylvania, 8 miles up the river from Pittsburgh, and also the Wabco plant in Wilmerding, Pennsylvania, which was Westinghouse Air Brake. They were both being shut down. So the Tri-State Conference on Steel was literally fighting 6 or 7 battles at one time. I was fighting all these grievances inside of the mill. And at the same time this was happening, steelworkers' benefits were running out, and steelworkers had to start finding work. And we had 2 problems for Homestead steelworkers. Number one, there was no jobs. You had to leave the area if you wanted to find work, or you ended up working for minimum wage. And number 2, you were from Homestead. And Homestead had a reputation by this time because of our militancy. So much so that I got phone calls from steelworkers who were applying for jobs in New Jersey and as far away as Florida, calling me up and saying, Mike, you ain't gonna believe this. They're not gonna give me a job because I worked at Homestead. Workers in their 40s and 50s were extremely discriminated against. Nobody would hire any workers in their 40s and 50s. Quickly, what happened was our battle fell apart simply because our army fell apart. Our army was dispersed throughout the 50 states, states of the United States. I can't speak for Alaska, but I can speak for Hawaii. Steelworkers are in every state. And proof of that is when you watch the Pittsburgh Steelers for the last 10 or 15 years, and they play at another city, I don't care if it's San Diego or Oakland or Miami, Florida, the announcers would always say, oh my God, there's like, look at this, there's as many Steeler fans here as there are Miami Dolphin fans. What the heck? Boy, they really travel. But no, they don't travel good. Those are former steelworkers and their kids that now live in the Miami area. steel workers were dispersed everywhere. So what happened was Local 1397, Tri-State Conference on Steel were left with a battle plan. We had a couple allies like the United Electrical Workers, but we had no army. And what we were calling for was the exact same thing that the Green New Deal is calling for today. I can tell you almost verbatim what we called for was a complete overhaul of our infrastructure in this area. And by infrastructure, I'm talking transportation, I'm talking water mains, I'm talking roads and bridges, I'm talking wastewater treatment facilities. We had a whole battle plan for putting together and putting back to work tens of thousands of people. We had a conference, we called, we had a headline on the newspaper, and the headline said, local group calls for Marshall Plan for the Mon Valley. And that's exactly what we called for, a new, improved Marshall Plan. Our Marshall Plan included Medicare for all. Our Marshall Plan included new ownership that included the workers and the communities. Our Marshall Plan included new and the most up-to-date technology and equipment. And our Marshall Plan included a new and improved and real relationship with the community and also between the workers and whoever management was. Well, we had no army
I think that's
to back up
great.
our Marshall Plan, so we lost the war.
I think that's a great place to pause and to welcome Matt Callahan, who I believe is in the house, and also to begin the discussion because you just started getting toward the point where into the present. And I think one of the some of the really interesting themes of the book, which you've touched on, are the creativity that was involved in the struggle to for Local 1397. The way in which, not just in the grievance system, but also in the paper, people were sort of recognized a new kind of part of themselves, a new express themselves in another kind of way. So there was a sense, and I feel it's very strong in the book, the sense of pleasure that was also part of the union struggle. You know, the fact that social unionism, social movement unionism was also about being social, about sociality, about being joyful, there being joy in the struggle. I mean, we've ended with the collapse, but the idea of joy in the struggle is not a dead idea. The second thing that I think is really critical theme in the book is that while here you've been talking about war stories, the book really does talk about mistakes. That you've touched on some of them, but mistakes along the way in how, not just of tactics, but also of politics or consciousness, on race, on gender. You had that brouhaha with the right wing, but that brouhaha did not really settle long simmering issues that were, of course, present in the plant, present in the union, because they're present in society, chiefly issues of race, of ideology, of sexism. And that gets to the question also of division, which I think is another theme that you've touched on, and violence, which you've touched on clearly. And so I would like Matt to be able to weigh in here, but I would like us to try to bring the discussion into the present, into the situation as it is now seen by young people, about history as a living thing. And particularly, I'm curious, and you can address this at any time. And again, I'd like Matt to weigh in first before you answer, but particularly on how we reconceptualize violence as something that's right now we're all riveted to the question of police violence, but the Black community has experienced violence in many forms for a long time. The working class has experienced violence in many forms for a very long time, and so has anyone alive who is subjected to power. Power always has a choice, and it has typically, for hundreds of years, chosen violence. So, so I'm going to hand it over to Matt, but I would be interested in your thoughts going forward about the lessons of the struggle, not so much in particulars, but in these large conceptual ways for the present, and for younger activists, for older activists, for people who are living and trying to negotiate this period.
Well, I'm sorry for being late. My apologies, but I think your questions should be addressed, maybe not to interrupt the flow, but I'll simply concur that they're important questions, particularly the relevance of these historical struggles to the present day, that being one of your main points. The other is that I think that the the relationship between work, whatever kind of exploited labor it is, and the kinds of industries that were wiped out. You know, there's sort of a myth that the working class disappeared with the steel mills. It didn't. It just got unemployed and put into lower wage, lousier conditions. The victories that were won by the working class in the unions for better wages and conditions and so forth were what were destroyed, not workers per se. So I just think those two questions are just sort of our addendum to what your questions are about, because I think it does relate at least to the sort of the way the discussion unfolds in the mainstream media, or what people think, perhaps younger people think about what being a member of the working class is.
Mm-hmm.
Can I address, I want to address that, Matt, and I want to address JoAnn's thing. First off, I want to say throughout this entire period of history, we really saw each other as more than just fellow workers. We saw each other as a family, and we saw each other as, I dare say, a big tribe of tribes. And the tribes came together back then, and we socialized. We had parties throughout this thing, and all these struggles and all these death and all this destruction. We had parties. I mean, we partied 300 to 600 people when we had the rank and file movement inside the mill together. We had social gatherings that were more, because the steel workers, just like workers, a lot of workers today depend on each other almost like a family. And when you go into a workplace, your lives depend on each other. And there's this organic sense of solidarity that a lot of people who don't work in a place, whether it's Amazon today or Google, or whether it's the steel mill back then, have a bond with each other. That's one thing. Secondly, the lessons of all this, JoAnn, and to all of you out there, is the lesson of this whole period is two lessons. Number one is coalitions and coalition building. And number two is solidarity and democracy. And you can't have any successful movement without those two pillars. And lastly, organization. And I've just watched in my last 50 years, 60 years of activism. I've been an activist since a teenager. These big movements come and go and grow in the thousands and thousands, but without any organized effort, to pull different disparaging parts of the movement together, whether it was around the issues, whether it was around the gender or the nationality or the location or whatever, that there needs to be an organized effort that goes on at the same time that people are taking to the streets. So we always had a vision back then of coalition building, of how we could look at other movements and other sectors of society and figure out what our common ground was with them, and actively went out and built those coalitions. That is a critical lesson, I think, today, and the need for organization today, and also the role that people don't know. And I haven't seen Matt Callahan for 44 years, and he's been one of the biggest influences in my life, because he understands the intersectionality and interrelatedness between culture, between music in particular, and between work, and between living your life. And there's this organic connection that we saw it back then in the Homestead days. I see it today. And I think we need to figure out today the lessons from the 1980s. And the lessons is people from all, and you just take, I'll just give you an idea. In Pittsburgh alone, we have all these different groups doing all these different incredible amounts of work. We need to get them together. And the biggest example I can think of too is the issue of race. And the issue of race is an issue that's playing out in the communities, it's playing out in the workplaces, and it's playing out in the political arena. We have here in the Pittsburgh area, for the first time in our history, a Black militant socialist who is a member of our state legislature named Summer Lee. And Summer Lee is Mike Stout, female, Black, and young. And she opens her mouth. She does it articulate. She's as articulate as anybody I know. And the power structure did everything they could just now to get her out of office. I mean, I've never seen a smut campaign in my life. And you know what? It wasn't just the Black folks that voted for her, it was the white folks that voted for her. And this area and this time has changed, and these young people have changed, and these young people aren't satisfied with the status quo. These young people aren't, they didn't have to hear the unbearable red baiting and yellow apparel and red this and that back that we were barraged with every day. The young people today have a whole different concept of socialism, a whole different concept of community, and they're willing to get out in the streets and fight for it. I think what they need to also understand is we need a battle plan at the same time. We don't need to just get out and fight. We need to fight for a particular plan. And I think we need an organization. I hate to bring it up. I don't want to bring up the word party. I don't want to bring up this, that, but we need an organization to coordinate, not dominate, coordinate all the different efforts that's going on now against this system. And I said the same thing when I was 18 as I say right now. Our main enemy and our main problem is the capitalist system. And until we deal with that, every one of our efforts are going to end up falling by the wayside.
Well, JoAnn, did you want to follow up on that?
I mean, go ahead.
Well, one of the speaking of this question of organization, and again, returning to the book, actually, I'm not bouncing back and forth between the past and the present. One of the things I was struck by in the book that maybe you can address, Mike, is the actual role of unions and union leadership. Obviously, you're focusing mainly on the rank and file caucus and the work that you did, which, you know, is largely unknown. And, you know, even when it was going on and I was active on the West Coast, I didn't know it was going on. So, you know, it's a really important piece of history writing just to inform people about something that was really important at that time. But I think the thing about organization, particularly in the present day, is that many young people are still hoping through Democratic Socialists of America or through the Bernie campaign or through a variety of other activities that somehow they're going to have a coalition that includes the unions. And to me, one of the biggest factors, I mean, having been in a union myself and reading the trials and travails in your book, I'm reminded of the fact that this question of business unionism, as a lot of young people may not be familiar with that term, but that was the instrument, if you want to say, that was used essentially since the 30s to crush the unions and to make sure that the long-term plan, of course, was to destroy unions altogether, but it was to do it from within. And I think that the obstacles that places remain. In other words, you didn't get rid of the business union. It's still there, so that with a few notable exceptions, particularly on local levels, unions are still dominated by that ideology. And so even if they profess to want to organize and bring out, organize the working class now, and maybe they're making some efforts, I think that's still a big problem today. Because, in other words, the question of how do you organize people and how do you organize workers in particular as workers, this question of the union, the form of the union and so on, seems to me fraught.
Yeah.
Agree with you 100%. And I think that's one of the main challenges in the conclusion of this book is I put a challenge out to the organized labor movement. I said, if you don't change your ways, I said, you're going to be, you're not going to just fall through the dustbins of history. You're going to be the dust. And these companies in this system hate them as much as they hated them in 1930. And they're using them right now in many ways as shock troops between them and the mass movements, whether it's healthcare, the environment, or Black Lives Matter, or the Me Too. They're kind of using the unions for the most part. It's not just a question, Matt, of business unionism. It's what I call circle the wagons unionism too. And circle the wagons unionism means even for the best of the best in their ranks is I take care of my members. Fuck everybody else. I don't care. I know this stuff's bad or good or whatever happening out there, but I don't care because all I care about is my members. That's all I care about. And that's not the way it works. And that's not the way it worked back then and works now.
And that's a very long, right. That's a very long struggle and argument. And, back in the days of there was a lot of rank and file militancy in the 1970s, and people should know that. It was cheek by jowl with all the other social movements that were rising up in the 60s and the 70s, and it's often forgot. But one of the figures in the union democracy movement, Jock Jablonski, who was the leader of the United Mine Workers democracy movement and was murdered ultimately, he said that that unions, the job of unions is to secure the future, the future of the people. And the question has always been how, and this relates to what both of you said, is how the union stands not just for its members, but for the class, which after all is so much larger than the organized workforce. I mean, if you have at best 10% of workers organized into unions, that's, you can't hope to get anything for your people unless you think about your charge as the raising up and the protection and the defense and the expansion of the class, the expansion of the life chances of the class. So I was, it's not surprising, but it's deeply indicative of the mistake that is made over and over and over and over again, that of all the unions that have been asked so far about what they think about the actions on the streets at the moment for justice, for the ability to breathe and live of Black people, and all people, but Black people in particular, all the unions that were asked about the police union and whether there's a problem with the fact that police unions are uniquely positioned. They are, by their contract, by their collective bargaining agreement, unlike every other collective bargaining agreement, they are allowed to be unaccountable essentially to the masses of people, to the class, to the community. And every union that was asked, CWA, Unite Here, Teamsters, SEIU, AFSCME, UAW, American Federation of Teachers, the AFL Federation, none of them would respond to what responsibility the union has to actually reform itself and to have this this unjust and bizarrely unique aspect of their contracts eliminated. And you know, nobody would respond. But the irony is that all those unions have members who are members not just of the union but also of the class and of people who are endangered by the police. And I know this isn't really, you know, the subject of your book, but I do think it's kind of important at this moment when there's such an uprising and there's so much anger and fear and longing, really longing to live, you know, that we also think about what responsibility do the organizations that are already here? I mean, and what responsibility does organized labor and anyone who supports it or anyone who wants to work outside of it, you know, how can we think about that? Sorry, that's kind of all over, but you know what I mean.
I think that when you look at history, there's points in history where people under much worse conditions than we have today figured out how to come together and how to talk to each other. I mean, there was a strike in McKees Rocks at a U.S. Steel facility in 1909 where you had people who had 16 different nationalities and languages went out on strike, and they were out on strike for 2 months. And they learned how, when they were actually in the streets at the demonstrations and on the picket lines, how to form committees, how to start talking to each other when they spoke different languages. They worked it out while they were doing it. And I think the struggle today has got to do the same. There is a movement out there that I have not seen in my lifetime that's going on right now. It's fearless. And I don't know what's going on in your other cities, but I can tell you what's going on in Pittsburgh the last 10 days is they have taken over major roads, intersections, and bridges and tunnels. And the police not only have backed off, there was 2 or 3 incidences where they attacked, but there was such recourse from the public and from the demonstrators that the police have now backed off and are allowing these people to march around in the hundreds, sometimes 1,000, blocking major highways and roads at rush hour. So I don't know if that's happening in other cities, but I hope it not only keeps happening, but I hope it gets even more organized and more focused. And that is one of the lessons of the book is we need a movement. The movement clearly is out there. It needs to get focused, and it needs a plan, and it needs some type of organization. I don't care how dirty that word is to a lot of people, party, organization, committee, whatever you want to call it, has got to coordinate our activities and put forth an alternative to what we got. It's one thing to protest what we hate and what is being done to us, and the abuse people and oppression people are taking. It's another thing to say, okay, well, here's the alternative, and here's how we get from here to there. I think that is the question confronting us today that we tried to deal with unsuccessfully back in the 1980s.
Well, let me just interject one thing, and taking off from both those earlier comments from JoAnn's about the police and the unions and yours about the movement. I would just like to add two points that might help clarify some of the questions. One is that in your main talk, you were talking sort of the dirty word of the party, and then the dirty word of the organization or whatever. But I think that the thing is that unions, cooperatives, and political parties all focus on different things. And they are the forms of organization that within the United States, and you might say liberal democracies, because it's more or less the same in Europe, function to organize different parts of society. But the political party is directed overtly at political power. And ultimately, that is the question. So one of the problems with unions, and for that matter, cooperatives, is as soon as they actually take on this question of ownership, like your book describes, the plan to actually take over, whether it's as a union or as a cooperative or whatever, you're challenging private property. You're basically saying that workers should own this. One reality that certainly your experience, but I think experience generally has shown, is that at the point that you're actually going to challenge the power of capitalism, its state power, then you're in trouble. So in other words, Mondragon in Spain can be a functional cooperative that actually produces and manufactures goods, as long as they do not actually compete with capital, in Spain, and do not threaten the Spanish state. The same can be said of cooperatives in the United States. There's a long history of cooperatives in the United States, particularly amongst farmers, but even in the present day, you have Cooperation Jackson, which is an effort to organize in the African-American community in Jackson, Mississippi, and they're dealing with this problem right now, meaning they are organizing something to provide for the people, in a direct sense, but at the same time, they're up against the state. The state is going to limit what they can actually do. And so I think that unless young people are aware of these different forms of organization, and that ultimately there will have to be a confrontation with the state, and state power has to be taken, then they're going to be misled, and the errors will be repeated generation after generation after generation. To me, this is the ultimate lesson of your book, is that the efforts that you made were obviously in good faith, and you made an enormous commitment of time, energy, everything else, creativity, and what have you. But the defeat was not because you didn't try. The defeat was because there wasn't that kind of, you might say, the organizational structure to carry the struggle up to that level. And of course, that was true for working class struggles throughout the United States at that time. As you said, JoAnn, there were actually a lot. It's really been erased from history, what happened in the 70s.
Yeah.
It's all about hippies and protest against the war. But in fact, there were more strikes, I believe, in that period than it was an unprecedented number of strikes and militant labor activity, which has been pretty much wiped out in the public consciousness. But again, my point is simply that at some point, the union runs out of its ability to do anything except provide for better wages, hours, and working conditions. That's what its function is. And so until workers are trained or come together on a different basis, you're going to have this you might say, endless repetition.
Yeah, I think that, so I just wanted to add something, and then we have a couple of questions maybe we should ask, or comments we should make. But there's one thing I wanted to mention because of that 1970s past. I don't know if anyone that's under quarantine, yeah, which we supposedly still are, but it's amazing how one crisis backs into another, is displaced by another, but all these crises come together. But I'm not sure anyone watched Mrs. America over quarantine, and it seems, I know, like something that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I contend that it has everything to do with it, and it's really important when we think about history to think about our side, and also also the organizing of the other side, and what that show is about the organizing around the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and it's sort of a struggle between the mainstream feminists and Phyllis Schlafly, largely, who puts together an organization of Christian rightists, of secret and not so secret racists, of people who are anti-gay, people who want to restore the Bible as the center, well, not restore, but enshrine the Bible as the center of social life, people who are terrified about and legitimately scared about what's going on with the family and what's going on with their work, because it is in the 70s that this is happening, and the rate of profit has fallen, and people are losing their jobs, and people are losing their incomes, and everyone is under attack. And Phyllis Schlafly, she really wants power, is what she wants, and she's really not interested in the ERA, and she's not interested in abortion, and she's not interested in homosexuals, in the anti-homosexual fight. Her son is gay, and she's embarrassed by that, concerned about that, wants to keep that quiet. But what she really wants is Reagan elected. And what she really wants is US domination of the world. What she really wants is the end of any kind of nuclear, the détente with the Soviet Union. She wants a new Cold War. She wants to be in the centers of power that are really the high command, the commanding height, sorry. And so she uses this. She uses fear of sex and fear of children and fear of homosexuals and fear of abortion, or anger about abortion, or fear that women are going to somehow lose their privileged position about being homemakers. She uses that to build an army, talk about an army, to build an army that will elect Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is happy to accept that army. And Ronald Reagan is really not particularly, the show doesn't talk about this, but Ronald Reagan is not particularly interested in, bashing homosexuals or ending abortion or even the Equal Rights Amendment. But he is interested in those lists. He is interested in that organization. He is interested in power and in getting it. And what does he do? One of the first things he does in August of 1981 is he attacks the PATCO workers who are on strike, the air traffic controllers. And he eliminates over 1,000 jobs and replaces them with permanent replacement workers, which then signals to corporate America, you too can do this. You can, forget strikes as something that you just have to hash a lot and worry about and work out with your workers. Now you can just fire them. Now you can just bring in scabs. Now you can just send them to the four winds, and begins the new Cold War, and begins the kneecapping the working class all across the board, and begins then the unbelievable indifference toward tens of thousands of gay men dying of AIDS. So that history, it's really important to see how things that don't seem to be connected at all have been used to build political power and exert political power. And Phyllis Schlafly never got her positions. She never got to be the ambassador to the UN or any of the defense secretary, none of the other things she wanted. But she did change the politics at the time. She did elect Ronald Reagan. And so I think it's crucial that when we think about what history's been lost, and when we think about how we approach the future, to reject this false division of class and race, or class and sex, or class and sexual orientation, and to see that actually, life is all of those things. So I wanted to make that point, and I'll just put in a tiny little plug, because I've just written a book which deals with a lot of things about sex, authority, power, the mess of life. And this is what it's called. It's called What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Me Too: Essays on Sex, Authority, and the Mess of Life. So that's my commercial. Sorry. But Alan Hart just made a point on Mike's reference to Summer Lee, saying that not only was she opposed by the Democratic Party establishment, but by the Allegheny County Labor Council, the Building Trades Union, the USW International, that the campaign was sleazy beyond words, that a few unions, UE, SEIU, Pittsburgh teachers, backed her. But what was really striking, and where we should take some faith, I guess, in the class, and so it's not all just a story of defeat, you know, is that working class voters, he says, are far more progressive than the so-called labor leadership, in that she won 76% to 24%. And I know that all of these victories are small victories, but you also mention in your book something about, you use the phrase how you have to play the cards you're dealt. And I thought that was, you're talking about in the context of the struggle, Mike, but I think it's also really useful, simple phrase to think about in larger terms, because we're often so stuck in this debate about between incrementalism and radical restructuring. And so when you're playing the hands you're dealt, you have to work on multiple levels. And so a victory for the sister, and what that says about people is you know, is playing one hand. There are many, many other hands to play.
I would say that there's three things, you know, for today's hundreds of thousands of activists that are out there. There's three things about that run through this book, and Matt mentioned one of them. But the three things are: number one is solidarity, and solidarity is our number one. As long as they keep us divided, our class of people, the people that make and do everything in this country, as long as they keep us divided, whether it's sex, race, nationality, this or that or whatever, as long as they keep us divided, we're not going to win. Secondly is democracy. And by democracy, it's not some, you know, just vague word. Democracy is participation at some level or degree. And to us, when we were building our local union, our caucus, democracy meant getting as many people involved as we possibly could in their own, so that it's not just I'm paying union dues, but I'm actually involved in the union. We tried to create as much space for them to do that. And I think the same thing applies in society at large, and certainly today. We need to create democracy. And the third thing, and Matt really touched on it, is I firmly believe that even if we would have been successful for a short period of time and put together a public-private employee buyout, that capital would have crushed us. The globalization that was going on, that was just picking up steam back in the 1980s and really went into full throttle around 2000, was relentless. And there was a couple mills around here saved. One up Venango Steel, but they all died. Weirton Steel, gone. They're all gone. Capital is in control, and their class and their system and the state are in control. And we can win as many victories as we want, but until we have a movement that actually challenges that and actually says no. And this is, if you go to the end of my book, it doesn't just say we need solidarity and democracy. It says we need to challenge them with an independent political movement. And we can't wish it into act. It's something that people have got to sit down and plan for. And the other thing I'd like to say, which you mentioned earlier, and I've alluded to with Matt, is it's got to be fun. It's got to be social. It's got to have music. It's got to have culture. We've got to create a different culture if we're going to create a different system of ownership, of economics. It's got to have a different culture, and we've got to create it. And there was a period of time, I want everybody here to know, and the year I believe was 1969, 70 in there, where there was a merging of black-white culture that was so fucking enthralling and so exhilarating. And so, I mean, Marvin Gaye was singing to white and blacks. The Chamber Brothers were singing to white and black. Jimi Hendrix was singing to white and black. There was this crossover of cultures that was just, and I hope it happens today. And I'm seeing it happen in the streets, but I hope it happens in politics. I hope it happens in every other realm that our cultures see. Being separated is not the answer. Being together is our only answer.
I think that's a great place to end. I thank you so much, everybody, for being with us. Mike, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book. Everybody, go out and get it. It's a terrific book. Homestead Steel Mill, The Final 10 Years. It's not just about those final 10 years, as Mike is called, and it's a very beautiful book. And it's a very important book, and I'm honored to have been associated with it and to be here with you today and with all of you. And so thank you, John Flanders, for organizing this, the Connolly Forum for this Zoom event, which I guess is the first. And under these difficult circumstances, it's really good to, it's good, as you say, it's good to be together. It's important.
And I want to thank you, JoAnn. To be real blunt, without you, Stout and Lynn, and Charlie McAllister, the book would have never happened. And it was a conversation, one conversation that we had for about an hour and a half that really propelled me to stop procrastinating and do the book. Matt, you have no idea, you have no clue, no vaguest notion of what an influence musically, culturally, you had vis-a-vis the workers' movement. It's something that's stuck with me for 44 years, and I don't have to see your face to feel it. And thirdly, the people out there, and I see a lot of them that are listening, is I'm with you. We need a militant, radical, mass movement in this country to get what we're going to need to get. And the state is going to take us on. And the only way we're going to beat them, you know, you could say what you could say about Jim Morrison, but there was one line in one song Jim Morrison says he says, they got the guns, but we got the numbers. And we have got the numbers, and we've got to let them know we've got the numbers. And whether it's a Green New Deal, or whether it's women's rights, or whether it's ending discrimination once and for all, whatever the issues out there are, our platform is that we're going to fight to get it, and that we're going to have fun doing it. And my book showed us how that happened back in the 1970s and 80s, and it's got to happen again, bigger and better.
And as Alan Hart says to everybody, Sly Stone told us to stand. And so, yeah, we got to stand. We got to stand with everybody who's fighting in the streets today. We've got to stand with everybody who will in the future. And bravo. Thank you. Thank you.